The British Empire was one of the most significant forces shaping the modern world, stretching over 4 centuries from the 16th century until the early post-World War II era. At its peak, the empire covered almost 13.7 million square miles and governed nearly a quarter of the world's population. This vast dominion spanned every continent, and its rise, height, and decline reflect complex dynamics of power, economy, culture, and influence. The British Empire's impact on the modern world is visible today in language, governance, economics, culture, and even in international relations. The British Empire's inception coincided with the Age of Exploration, a period when European nations embarked on extensive voyages to discover new lands, trade routes, and riches. England, initially overshadowed by Spain and Portugal, began to make its mark through explorers like Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, and John Cabot. These explorers charted new territories, particularly in the Americas, and laid the groundwork for British overseas ambitions. The British Empire formally began with settlements in North America and the Caribbean. The first enduring English colony was Jamestown in Virginia, established in 1607. However, early colonial ventures were marked by severe struggles, including harsh climates, conflict with indigenous populations, and difficulty in sustaining settlements. Despite these challenges, colonies grew slowly, driven by the promise of new resources and economic wealth. In 1600, the British East India Company was founded with a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I, empowering it to trade with Asia. This company would eventually spearhead British expansion into India and parts of Southeast Asia. Initially formed to import spices and luxury goods, the East India Company gradually became more powerful, establishing trading posts and even private armies to protect British interests. The 17th century was marked by fierce rivalries among European powers, especially between Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands. Britain invested heavily in its navy, which quickly became one of the most formidable in the world. The Royal Navy's strength allowed Britain not only to protect its trade routes, but also to capture strategic locations, establish colonies, and fend off competing empires. The Caribbean colonies, such as Jamaica and Barbados, became economic powerhouses for Britain, especially with the establishment of sugar plantations. These plantations were dependent on the brutal transatlantic slave trade, which transported millions of Africans to the Americas under inhumane conditions. The wealth generated from Caribbean colonies, along with North American tobacco and cotton, contributed significantly to Britain's rising economy and strengthened its hold over its colonies. In North America, the 13 colonies grew rapidly, with settlers establishing prosperous towns and cities along the Atlantic coast. Meanwhile, in Canada, British settlers established footholds after wars with the French. These territories helped build the foundation for Britain's colonial empire in the Americas. By the mid-18th century, the British East India Company had transitioned from a trading corporation to a political and military power in India. The company defeated local rulers and competing colonial powers, most notably in the Battle of Plassey in 1757, securing Bengal and other regions. This victory laid the groundwork for what would become the British Raj, a period of British dominance in India. The British governance in India was complex and often exploitative. Indian agriculture, for example, was redirected to serve British needs, causing widespread poverty and contributing to famines. Despite the exploitation, British rule introduced infrastructure such as railways, telegraph lines, and irrigation projects. English education also became more widespread, producing a generation of Indian elites who would later play a crucial role in the Indian independence movement. As British influence grew, so did its trading empire in Asia. Following the Opium Wars with China in the mid-19th century, Britain acquired Hong Kong and secured lucrative trade agreements, including the right to export opium to China. These gains highlighted Britain's economic focus and willingness to use military force to secure commercial interests. The 19th century marked the British Empire's peak. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain, gave the nation a technological advantage over other countries, enabling it to mass-produce goods and innovate in manufacturing, transportation, and communication. British manufactured products dominated global markets, and colonies provided the raw materials to fuel British industry. Britain's expansion in Africa during the Scramble for Africa further exemplified its ambition. Motivated by a mix of economic interests, competition with other European powers, and a belief in spreading Western civilization, Britain acquired territories across the continent, including Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. The discovery of resources such as gold and diamonds made African colonies even more valuable, but this often came at the expense of local communities and traditions. This period of relative peace and stability, known as the Pax Britannica, was underpinned by Britain's powerful navy, which controlled key sea routes. The Royal Navy ensured the free movement of goods, protected colonies, and maintained British influence worldwide. However, British control was not without resistance, as colonies frequently saw uprisings and protests against foreign rule, such as the Indian Rebellion of 1857 and the Zulu Wars in Africa. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 marked a turning point for Britain's rule in India. The uprising, caused by widespread resentment against British exploitation and disrespect for local traditions, led to the dissolution of the East India Company. The British Crown assumed direct control of India, inaugurating the British Raj. Queen Victoria was declared the Empress of India in 1876, symbolizing Britain's commitment to its most valuable colony. Under the Raj, British authorities implemented reforms in administration, law, and education, but these changes primarily benefited the British and a small group of Indian elites. The extraction of resources from India continued, fueling British industry and economy. The British introduced railways and telegraph lines to control the vast territory, and Indian soldiers, sepoys, were conscripted to fight in British wars globally. Yet the benefits of these advancements were not evenly distributed, leading to economic hardship and famines among India's rural population. The 20th century proved to be the beginning of the end for the British Empire. World War I strained British resources and morale, and although Britain emerged victorious, the cost was high. The war spurred nationalist movements in colonies, particularly in India, where leaders like Mahatma Gandhi led campaigns for independence. The interwar period saw Britain trying to maintain control over its empire, but anti-colonial sentiment continued to grow. World War II further weakened Britain. The empire suffered from heavy bombings, resource shortages, and staggering military costs. After the war, Britain could no longer afford to maintain its global empire. Additionally, the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers pressured Britain to decolonize, as both powers supported self-determination. India gained independence in 1947, marking the start of a wave of decolonization across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Britain's African colonies, such as Nigeria and Kenya, followed suit in the 1950s and 1960s. The process was often peaceful but sometimes violent, as colonial powers clashed with independence movements. The British Empire's impact can be seen globally. English is now the world's most widely spoken language, facilitating international communication and trade. British legal and parliamentary systems were adopted or adapted in many former colonies, influencing governance in countries like Canada, Australia, and India. Culturally, Britain's influence is deeply embedded in former colonies, from cricket in South Asia to British architecture in African capitals. However, the empire's legacy is also marked by lasting scars. Economic exploitation left many former colonies with underdeveloped economies, and the arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers often led to ethnic and political conflicts that persist today. The Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of former British colonies, reflects Britain's continuing connection with its former territories. The Commonwealth promotes mutual cooperation, trade, and cultural exchange, although its influence is largely symbolic. The British Empire's history is one of immense ambition, both constructive and destructive. It transformed a small island nation into a global superpower, creating a legacy that shaped the world in profound ways. From establishing English as a global language to spreading ideas of governance and industry, the empire's influence endures.